The toxic fog rolled thick across the valleys of Barbarous, a poisonous shroud that had choked the skies for millennia. In the lowlands, human settlements huddled beneath the miasma, their inhabitants condemned to brief lives of servitude and fear. Above them, in keeps of weeping grey stone built into the mountain fastnesses, inhuman overlords ruled through terror and dark sorcery. The atmosphere grew more virulent with altitude, the gases rising toward the dim yellow sun until even the hardiest creatures could not survive. It was here, in this crucible of poison and despair, that the seeds of the Death Guard were sown. Not in the gleaming laboratories of terror, nor in the pristine forges of Mars, but in the choking darkness of a world where every breath was an act of defiance against death itself. When the infant Primarch's gestation pod crashed onto Barbarous, it came to rest amid the carnage of a great battle. Bodies of the dead and dying stretched across the killing fields for miles in every direction, testament to the endless wars the overlords waged against one another. The greatest of these tyrants, a being known as Necare, discovered the child and named him Mortarion, Child of Death. The Overlord tested how high into the poisonous atmosphere the strange infant could survive, then erected a massive wall of black iron to cage him, moving his own fortress beyond it to the highest peaks where the air would kill even a Primarch. Necare raised Mortarion with cruel pragmatism, teaching him the ways of war and death, all while keeping him imprisoned within invisible boundaries of toxicity. Mortarion grew to adolescence in a realm of constant conflict and suffocating darkness. The sun existed only as a distant smudge through the perpetual clouds. The very air was death, requiring filtering apparatus and sealed suits for even brief exposure at higher elevations. The overlords commanded armies of the dead, stitched together corpses animated by foul sorcery, sent to terrorize the human populations below. Yet despite these horrors, or perhaps because of them, the young Primarch developed a superhuman resilience. His body adapted to the toxic environment, his lungs processing poisons that would kill ordinary men instantly. His flesh grew pale and gaunt from lack of sunlight and proper nourishment, but his strength was undeniable. He was a child of the Emperor, bearing within his genetic code abilities that transcended the limitations of his grim surroundings. Eventually, Mortarion descended from his cage to the human settlements in the valleys. The people were initially suspicious of this tall, pale stranger, who emerged from the poison fog, but he proved himself one of their own. He worked alongside them in the fields, his hands growing calloused from labour rather than conquest. When the Overlord's hunting parties descended to prey upon the villagers, Mortarion stood against them. His first victories were small, isolated skirmishes where determination and strength prevailed against supernatural power. But each triumph drew more followers to his banner, men and women hardened by lives spent breathing toxic air and facing the constant threat of undead armies. Mortarion moulded these recruits into a disciplined fighting force. He trained them to endure hardships that would break lesser warriors, to fight in conditions where others could not even survive. With the help of blacksmiths and artificers, he created specialized equipment, sealed suits of armor fitted with crude filtering hoses and breathing apparatus that allowed humans to venture higher into the fog. These warriors became the original Death Guard, named for their willingness to bring death to those who dwelt in the poisoned heights. They were the unbroken blades, forged in adversity, tempered by suffering, and sharpened by an unwavering commitment to liberation. The campaign against the Overlords was methodical and brutal. Mortarion led his Death Guard ever higher into the toxic strata, each victory pushing back the boundaries of what humans could endure. The constant exposure to poisons hardened his warriors, their bodies developing resistances through sheer necessity and force of will. They learned to fight any foe, in any atmosphere, with whatever weapons were at hand. The Overlords fell one by one, their grey keeps stormed and their undead legions scattered. The Death Guard became legendary not for their sophisticated tactics or advanced weaponry, but for their absolute refusal to yield regardless of the conditions or odds they faced. Yet one fortress remained unconquered. High above all others, beyond even the reach of Mortarion himself, stood the keep of Necare. The air at that altitude was so toxic that even the Primarch's enhanced physiology could not withstand it for long. Here the liberation campaign stalled. So close to total victory yet unable to claim the final prize, the Death Guard had freed the lowlands and mid-elevations, but the greatest tyrant still ruled from his mountain peak, a constant reminder that even the strongest had limits. It was during this stalemate that the Emperor arrived on Barbarous. The people greeted him as their saviour, heaping adulation upon this golden stranger who promised salvation and spoke of a great imperium spanning the stars. Mortarion seethed with jealousy and resentment. These were his people, freed by his hand, built into warriors by his training. Where had this stranger been during the long years of suffering? What right did he have to claim credit for victories won with blood and poison? The Emperor saw beyond Mortarion's anger to the prideful heart beneath. When the Primarch refused to bend knee, the Master of Mankind issued a challenge. If Mortarion could defeat Necare alone, the Emperor would depart and leave Barbarous to its own devices. But if Mortarion failed, he would swear fealty and join the Imperium. Against the protests of his death guard, Mortarion accepted. He climbed alone into the toxic clouds, driven by a compulsion to prove himself, to demonstrate that he needed no divine intervention to complete what he had begun. Higher and higher he ascended, each breath burning his lungs despite the filtering apparatus, each step a battle against suffocating death. The hoses of his breathing gear began to rot away in the virulent atmosphere. His vision blurred as toxic gases seared his eyes. Still he climbed, rage and determination warring with the simple biological reality that even Primarchs had limits. At the gates of Necare's citadel, Mortarion finally succumbed. He collapsed, choking on air so poisonous it was dissolving his protective equipment. Through dimming vision, he saw Necare emerge, ready to deliver the killing blow to this rebellious foundling who had dared challenge the natural order. Then a golden figure stepped between them, entirely unaffected by the deadly atmosphere. With a single stroke of his flaming blade, the Emperor slew Necare, claiming Mortarion's vengeance as his own. The Primarch had failed his challenge, and in that failure something bitter and poisonous took root in his heart. Mortarion bent knee as honour demanded, but the resentment never faded. The Emperor had stolen his final victory, denied him the proof that he was worthy, that he could triumph without divine assistance. Every time Mortarion looked at his Gene-Father, he remembered that moment of weakness, that public demonstration of his limitations. The Emperor had used warp-based powers to create the Primarchs in the first place, wielding the very sorcery Mortarion had learned to despise during his upbringing under Necare. This hypocrisy gnawed at him, a festering wound to his pride that would never fully heal. The Emperor granted Mortarion command of the 14th Legion, then known as the Dusk Raiders. Upon first seeing them, the Primarch declared them his unbroken blades and renamed them the Death Guard in honour of his army on Barbarous. The Legion's culture transformed to reflect their Primarch's experiences. Their armour, once decorated in the colours of Terran tradition, was repainted with unpainted ceramite and dark green trim, echoing the utilitarian aesthetic Mortarion favoured. Recruits began to be drawn primarily from Barbarous, young men and women already hardened by lives spent in toxic environments. The Death Guard developed a reputation as the Imperium's most resilient and enduring warriors. They specialised in attritional warfare, grinding their enemies into submission through sheer determination and staying power. Where other legions manoeuvred with finesse or struck with surgical precision, the Death Guard simply endured. They held ground that other forces abandoned, fought in atmospheres that killed unprotected humans in seconds, and weathered barrages that would break lesser formations. Their legendary resistance to poisons, diseases, and environmental hazards became a point of pride. They were the unbreakable core of any army of conquest, the immovable object against which enemy forces shattered themselves. Yet beneath this strength lay a fundamental arrogance. The Death Guard looked down upon weakness, viewing those who could not endure as fundamentally inferior. They developed a contempt for the frail, believing that individuals who could not survive the harshest conditions were not fit to judge what was best for themselves or others. This philosophy extended to their view of other legions and even civilian populations. The Death Guard saw themselves as superior precisely because they could endure what others could not. It was a pride born from legitimate accomplishment, but pride nonetheless. And pride has always been Chaos's preferred entry point into even the strongest souls. Before the Horus Heresy, the Death Guard differed from other legions in structure and composition. They were organised into 7 great companies, each nominally holding 70,000 warriors, though this theoretical strength was never fully achieved. Each great company was further divided into smaller battle companies, creating a hierarchy built on the sacred number 7. The Terran-born Astartes, who had originally comprised the Dusk Raiders, found themselves increasingly marginalized as Barbarous-born recruits flooded the Legion's ranks. Tensions grew between these groups, between those who remembered the old traditions brought from Old Earth and those who embraced the harsh doctrines Mortarion imported from his homeworld. Among the Barbarous-born warriors, one stood above all others. Callus Typhon had served as Mortarion's chief lieutenant during the wars against the Overlords, and he became the Legion's first captain after its reunification with the Primarch. Typhon possessed the blood of Barbaros's psychic warlords, inheriting formidable abilities he carefully concealed from Mortarion's anti-psyker scrutiny. During the Great Crusade, Typhon served alongside elements of the Wordbearers Legion, where he encountered Erebus, the Wordbearers' foremost chaplain and secret devotee of the ruinous powers. It was Erebus who inducted Typhon into the Seven-Pillared Lodge, one of the warrior lodges spreading through the Space Marine legions like a virus. Through these secret gatherings, Typhon glimpsed possibilities beyond the Emperor's grand vision. He saw a future where his psychic abilities would be a source of greatness rather than a shameful secret to be hidden. The lodges spoke of a different path, one where the Space Marines could shrug off the Emperor's yoke and achieve their true potential. Typhon kept these revelations to himself, biding his time, watching as the Great Crusade ground forward and the first cracks appeared in the Imperium's facade. Perhaps his eventual betrayal influenced Mortarion's own fall to the ruinous powers. Perhaps Mortarion would have walked a dark path regardless. History does not record which came first, only that both Primarch and First Captain would ultimately serve the same new master. When Horus made his move against the Emperor, Mortarion proved an easy recruit to the rebellion. Among the Primarchs, few had gotten along with the Death Lord, his dour personality and resentment of perceived slights making him difficult company. But Horus had always treated him with respect, and the Night Haunter shared his grim view of humanity's nature. The seeds of doubt the Emperor had sown on Barbarous had taken deep root. Mortarion's unresolved anger at being denied his rightful vengeance, his hatred of the psychic powers the Emperor had used to create the Primarchs, his contempt for what he viewed as the Imperium's hypocrisy, all these resentments made him receptive to Horus's arguments. The Death Guard joined the rebellion with characteristic thoroughness. On Istvan III, Mortarion willingly participated in the purge of potentially loyal elements within his legion, nearly one-third of his warriors. Virus bombs scoured the planet's surface, killing loyalist Death Guard alongside their brothers from other traitor legions. Those who questioned this brutal calculus were told it was necessary, that hard choices had to be made for the greater good of the rebellion. The Death Guard had always prided themselves on doing what needed to be done regardless of cost, now that philosophy was turned against their own brothers. At the drop site massacre on Istvan V, the Death Guard proved their worth to Horus's cause. They became the immovable object against which loyalist forces broke themselves. While other traitor legions maneuvered and struck with speed, the Death Guard simply held ground and absorbed everything thrown at them. Their legendary endurance turned the killing fields into a meat grinder, where loyalist hopes died alongside their warriors. The massacre cemented the Death Guard's reputation among the traitors as reliable, unbreakable, willing to do the dirty work that more glory-seeking legions avoided. As the heresy escalated toward its climax, Horus ordered Mortarion to eliminate the White Scars Legion. The Death Guard pursued their quarry to the Catullus Rift, where Jagatai Khan demonstrated why speed and maneuverability could overcome brute endurance. The White Scars escaped through a webway portal the Death Guard had no reason to expect, their Sagyar-Mazan kill squads buying time through heroic sacrifice. Before this confrontation, Mortarion had attempted to sway Jagatai to the traitor cause above the ruined world of Prospero. The Khan's sharp tongue proved more effective than his blade, cutting through Mortarion's rationalizations and exposing the hollowness beneath his rhetoric. The Death Lord retreated, choosing discretion over continuing a verbal battle he was losing. Eventually, Horus commanded Mortarion to bring the Death Guard to Terra for the final assault on the Imperial Palace. The Legion's fleet prepared for the journey, their ships loaded with warriors eager to prove themselves in the greatest battle the galaxy would ever see. They would fight beside their traitor brothers, breach the walls that had stood for 10,000 years, and tear down the Emperor's throne. Victory seemed inevitable. The Death Guard had never failed in their objectives, had never broken under pressure. What force could stop them now that they fought for a cause they believed in rather than an emperor they had learned to despise? but callous Typhon had other plans. As first captain, he held significant authority over the fleet's operations. He convinced Mortarion that the Legion's navigators had been compromised, receiving secret messages from Malcador the Sigillite, and needed to be eliminated as traitors within the ranks. Mortarion, his trust in his first captain absolute, agreed. The navigators were killed to the last, their bodies spaced or executed in the bowels of the ships they had guided for decades. Typhon reassured his Primarch that his own psychic abilities, enhanced by his warlord blood, would be sufficient to guide them through the warp safely to Terra. Though Mortarion hated relying on psychic powers, the very witchery he despised, he was left with no alternative. The fleet needed to reach Terra before the siege began, and only Typhon possessed the abilities to navigate the Empyrean without traditional navigators. The Death Guard made the transition into the warp, their ships slipping from real space into the roiling madness of the Immaterium. In that moment of transition, Mortarion damned himself and his entire legion. Typhon had delivered them into a trap more insidious than any enemy battle line, more deadly than any virus bomb. He had delivered them to Nurgle, the Lord of Decay, the Plague God who had been patiently waiting for this moment. The warp's strange tides proved fickle, exactly as Typhon had planned. The Death Guard fleet became becalmed, caught in eddies of corrupted reality with no clear path forward. Days stretched into weeks as the ships drifted aimlessly, their crews growing increasingly anxious. Typhon claimed he was searching for the right current to carry them to Terra, that the warp was unusually turbulent due to the psychic emanations of the ongoing war. Mortarion paced his flagship like a caged beast, sensing something wrong but unable to identify the source of his unease. His legion was trapped, helpless, directionless, exactly where Nurgle wanted them. Then came the first signs of sickness. A curious, paralyzing illness swept through the fleet, affecting warriors who should have been immune to disease. Space Marines collapsed at their stations, their enhanced physiology unable to fight off this supernatural contagion. The Death Guard had always prided themselves on their resistance to poisons and plagues, their barbarous enhanced constitutions able to weather biological weapons that devastated other forces. But this was no natural disease. This was the Destroyer Plague, one of Nurgle's most virulent creations, and against the power of the Plague God, even the Death Guard's legendary resilience meant nothing. The sickness spread from ship to ship with terrifying speed. Fat devil flies appeared in the thickening miasma that filled the vessels, their buzzing filling the corridors like a mocking dirge. Where these warp-spawned insects bit, flesh turned to suppurating jelly. The demon venom of their stings caused tissue to blossom into hard new growths, tumorous masses that erupted from bodies with agonizing speed. Bellies distended with corpse gas, bloating until warriors could barely move under the weight of their own corrupted flesh. Eyes ran like cracked eggs, weeping pus and vitreous fluid down diseased cheeks. Even the ceramite of their power armor began to meld and flow into strange new shapes, fusing with the wearers' bodies until flesh and machine became one grotesque whole. The Death Guard's superhuman resilience, their greatest strength, became their worst enemy. They could not simply die and escape the torment. Their enhanced constitutions kept them alive even as the plague ravaged their bodies, prolonging their suffering beyond anything a normal human would endure. Warriors who had stood firm against artillery barrages and walked through toxic atmospheres without flinching, now writhed in delirium, begging for death that would not come. The ships echoed with screams and moans, the sounds of the strongest and toughest of the Emperor's warriors reduced to crippled wretches, assailed by fever dreams and unending agony. Mortarion watched his legion die by degrees, helpless to stop it. He moved among his warriors, trying to offer what comfort he could, seeking solutions where none existed. When the first Death Guard succumbed completely, bloating beyond recognition before bursting in a shower of putrid fluids and plague flies, the Primarch knew they faced something beyond conventional warfare. This was not an enemy that could be defeated through endurance or determination. This was corruption at its most fundamental level, an assault on the very nature of what they were. The Primarch sought to save Raheb Zurich, the first to fall completely to the Destroyer Plague, but even death brought no freedom from suffering. Zurich's body swelled to enormous proportions, his skin and armour becoming a single fused mass. Great funnels of pestilential bone burst from his corpse, towers of calcified corruption through which thousands of Nurgle's demon flies poured. The dead warrior became a breeding ground, a hive for disease-carrying demons that spread the contagion further with each new generation. What remained of Zurich was gnawed from the inside out by his unwanted passengers, his rotten shell teeming and heaving with squirming life that was no longer remotely human. Nurgle's answer came not as words, but as sensation. The pain did not vanish instantly. That would have been too simple, too clean. Instead, it transformed, shifting from unbearable agony into something else entirely. The Death Guard felt their suffering become purposeful, each lesion and boil now part of a greater design. The demon flies ceased their random feeding and began to organize, restructuring corrupted flesh according to patterns older than humanity. The transformation accelerated. What had been torture became metamorphosis, the birth pangs of something new emerging from the corpse of what had been. Throughout the becalmed fleet, warriors experienced the change differently, yet all arrived at the same destination. Some embraced it immediately, grateful for any escape from the torment. They opened themselves to Nurgle's gifts and were rewarded with swift transformation, their bodies bloating and mutating within hours until they barely resembled their former shapes. Others resisted, clinging to their loyalty to the Emperor even as their flesh betrayed them. These warriors took longer to change, their extended struggle resulting in more extreme mutations, but whether willing or reluctant, all eventually succumbed. The Destroyer Plague was not an infection that could be fought with will alone. The physical alterations were grotesque beyond description. Bodies swelled with unnatural growths, bellies distending with corpse gas and squirming parasites. Flesh bloated until it pressed against the interior of power armor, then began fusing with the ceramite itself. The boundary between warrior and warplate dissolved as organic tissue flowed into machinery, and mechanical components grew into living meat. Skin took on pallid, diseased hues, marked with lesions that wept pus and ichors of colours that should not exist in nature. Boils erupted across exposed surfaces, some bursting to release clouds of spores, others hardening into crusty scabs that cracked and reformed in endless cycles. The Death Guard's legendary endurance, the very quality that had made them the Imperium's most resilient warriors, became the mechanism of their damnation. Their enhanced constitutions refused to let them die, even as every biological system failed. Hearts continued beating even when blood turned to sludge. Lungs drew breath even when filled with pestilent fluid. Brains maintained consciousness even as neural tissue rotted and reformed in alien configurations. They could not escape through death, could not find release in oblivion. Instead, they were condemned to experience every moment of their transformation with agonizing clarity. Yet within this horror came unexpected relief. As Nurgle's blessing took full hold, the pain began to fade. Not through healing, the corruption continued unabated, but through a fundamental change in how they perceived their condition. The rotting of their flesh no longer registered as suffering. The constant oozing of wounds became merely sensation without negative valence. They were still dying, would be dying for all eternity, but death had lost its sting. They had become deathless in their decay, immortal in their corruption, eternal in their plague-ridden existence. The psychological transformation proved even more profound than the physical. The Death Guard had always prided themselves on their stoicism, their ability to endure anything without complaint. But that stoicism had been born from necessity, a grim acceptance of harsh realities. Now they experienced something different entirely. A strange contentment settled over them. Acceptance not through resignation, but through genuine embrace of their new nature. They looked upon their corrupted forms and saw not abomination, but perfection. Each lesion was a badge of Nurgle's favour, each parasite a blessing from the grandfather of plagues. Some Death Guard went further, descending into a perverse joy at their transformation. They laughed as their flesh sloughed away, giggled as maggots writhed in their unhealing wounds. The horror that should have driven them mad instead became a source of dark merriment. They had become that which they once feared, death incarnate, and in becoming it they had conquered it. How could they fear dissolution when they were dissolution? How could they dread disease when they were disease? The philosophical paradox delighted them, fueling their descents into Nurgle's cheerful nihilism. Others embraced their transformation for different reasons, motivated not by joy but by a bitter desire for revenge against a galaxy that had wronged them. If the Imperium had cast them aside, if the Emperor had abandoned them to this fate, then they would become the instruments of that civilization's downfall. They would spread the gifts that Nurgle had given them across every world the Emperor claimed. They would transform the Imperium's sterile order into beautiful chaos, replace its rigid hierarchies with the democracy of decay. Every human who fell to their plagues would be a strike against the false Emperor who had failed to save them. Mortarion's own transformation exceeded that of his sons in scope and horror. The Primarch's already towering frame grew taller still, stretching as if pulled on some invisible rack. His pale skin, marked by decades of exposure to Barbaros's poisons, darkened with necrotic discoloration. The rebreather mask he had worn since youth fused permanently with his face, the breathing apparatus burrowing deep into his transformed lungs. Great wings erupted from his back, not the magnificent pinions of an angel, but ragged membranes that dripped with pestilent condensation and supported his weight through unnatural buoyancy, rather than aerodynamics. The Deathlord's power grew in proportion to his physical corruption. He could now survive in environments that would kill even other Primarchs, his body adapting instantly to any toxin or disease. He exhaled clouds of lethal miasma with each breath, creating zones of corruption around himself that withered living things and corroded unliving materials. His very presence caused reality to sicken, the warp and materium bleeding together in his vicinity to birth spontaneous outbreaks of demonic infestation. He had become more than a Primarch, elevated to something approaching demonhood while retaining enough of his original essence to still be called Mortarion rather than simply a demon prince. Yet the greatest change was not in his body, but in his relationship to the Immaterium. Before, Mortarion had despised psychic powers, viewing them as the tools of tyrants and the source of humanity's greatest sufferings. Now he found himself intrinsically connected to the warp through his bond with Nurgle. He could sense the ebb and flow of pestilence across the galaxy, feel every plague that bloomed and every disease that claimed new victims. The Garden of Nurgle opened before his perception, a realm of rot and renewal where entropy and growth existed in perfect balance. In that garden, he glimpsed truths about the nature of existence that his previous understanding could never have encompassed. When the Death Guard fleet finally emerged from the warp, they were entirely changed. The ships themselves bore marks of corruption, their hulls stained with spreading rust and biological growths that pulsed with obscene vitality. The once gleaming white and grey armour of the Legion had darkened to sickly greens and browns, every surface pitted with corrosion and oozing with substances best left unexamined. Where the 14th Legion had entered the Empyrean, the first Plague Marines emerged, walking hives of death and abomination devoted absolutely to the Lord of Decay. They had missed their scheduled arrival at Terra by months. The siege had already begun without them, the other traitor legions battering against the Imperial Palace's defences, while the Death Guard remained trapped in Nurgle's embrace. But Horus welcomed them regardless, perhaps not fully understanding the magnitude of what had transpired, but recognising that Mortarion's warriors, despite their horrific transformation, remained formidable fighters. He assigned them a place in the siege lines, and the Death Guard took to their task with methodical determination. On Terra, the Death Guard proved that their corruption had not diminished their military effectiveness. If anything, it had enhanced it. They advanced across killing grounds where other legions stalled, their resilience now literally supernatural. Artillery barrages that would have shredded normal Space Marines barely slowed them. Virus weapons designed to kill through biological contamination found no purchase on bodies already host to every plague Nurgle could devise. Even direct hits from melter weapons and plasma cannons often failed to kill them outright, the Death Guard's rotting bodies continuing to function through damage that should have been instantly fatal. The Death Guard were the first traitorous starts to make landfall on Terra proper during the siege, drop pods slamming into the poisoned earth on the 7th day of Quartus. They deployed alongside the beached Arc Mechanicus vessels of the Dark Mechanicum, the massive ships providing void shields and firing platforms, while Mortarion's warriors advanced through the trenches surrounding the Imperial Palace. The Death Guard unleashed weapons that made conventional warfare seem almost merciful by comparison. Gas attacks filled entire defensive lines with choking clouds that dissolved flesh from bone. Biological weapons turned soldiers into plague zombies that shambled forward to spread infection to their former comrades. Even the ground itself became corrupted where they walked, soil turning to diseased mud that bred pestilent organisms. The outer trenches fell within hours. Imperial army troops, already stretched thin defending kilometres of fortification, found themselves facing enemies who could not be killed by conventional means. Laser-gun fire that would have felled normal humans barely registered on the bloated forms of plague marines. Explosive rounds detonated inside corrupted bodies without dropping their targets. Flamers that should have cremated flesh instead seemed to encourage the growth of heat-resistant fungal colonies. The defenders broke and fled, those who could not escape fast enough succumbing to diseases that killed in minutes or transformed them into shambling carriers who turned on their fellows. Yet the Death Guard's advance was not without opposition. The Imperial Fists and Blood Angels defended key positions with fanatical determination, their gene-forged bodies providing some resistance to the plagues being deployed against them. At the Eternity Gate, Sanguinius himself stood as the final bulwark against the traitor hordes, his noble presence a stark contrast to the corrupted forms that pressed against the palace's innermost defences. The Blood Angels Primarch rejected Horus's surrender demands and led counterattacks that drove the Death Guard back from critical choke points, buying time for the defenders to regroup and fortify. The siege ground on for weeks, then months. The Death Guard proved relentless, advancing whenever opportunity presented itself, holding ground when pushed back, never breaking regardless of casualties. Their presence transformed entire districts of Terra into plague-riddled wastelands. The Palatine Arc, once an ornate and affluent area where high-level administratum officials lived, became known as Poxville after the Death Guard unleashed horrific biological weapons that left the entire region a suppurating wound in Terra's surface. The stench of corruption spread for kilometres, and survivors reported the ground itself had become soft and yielding like diseased flesh. At the Lion's Gate spaceport, the Death Guard clashed with the White Scars in brutal close-quarters combat. Jagatai Khan had led a lightning raid to recapture the strategic location, and the Khan's warriors found themselves bogged down fighting Mortarian's Legion in the spaceport's corridors and landing bays. The Death Guard's supernatural resilience proved the perfect counter to the White Scars' hit-and-run tactics. Speed meant nothing when the enemy simply would not fall. Precision strikes failed when there were no vital organs left to target. The battle devolved into a grinding slog through plague-infested industrial zones. The climax came when Mortarion himself entered the fray. The Demon Primarch stalked through the spaceport wreathed in toxic fog, his scythe silence reaping loyalist lives with each swing. Jagatai Khan met him in single combat, the two Primarchs dueling amid the carnage while their sons fought and died around them. The White Scars Primarch fought with desperate fury, knowing that if Mortarion claimed the spaceport, the siege would enter a new and more terrible phase. Yet the Deathlord seemed unkillable, his corrupted body absorbing wounds that should have been mortal and continuing to fight. Through cunning rather than brute force, Jagatai turned the duel in his favour. He allowed Mortarion to deliver what appeared to be a killing stroke, then used that moment of perceived victory to decapitate his corrupted brother. The psychic shockwave of a Demon Primarch's banishment staggered every Death Guard warrior in the spaceport, disrupting the Gestalt connection that bound them to their gene father. In that moment of confusion and disorientation, the White Scars rallied and drove the plague-ridden warriors from the critical installation. Mortarion would return from the warp eventually, but the spaceport was lost. Without their Primarch to guide them, the Death Guard fell back under Typhus's command. The Herald of Nurgle proved a capable if uninspired leader, maintaining defensive positions but lacking Mortarion's strategic brilliance. The Death Guard continued fighting as the siege reached its climax, participating in the assault on the Bare Bastion and the final desperate pushes toward the Sanctum Imperialis. But they were no longer the spearhead of the traitor advance, reduced to supporting roles as the World Eaters and Sons of Horus took prominence in Horus's final gambit. When the Warmaster died aboard the vengeful spirit slain by the Emperor in their final confrontation, the psychic shockwave rippled across the traitor forces. The Sons of Horus, sensing their gene father's demise, broke immediately and fled for their ships. But the Death Guard, true to their nature, did not panic or rout. Instead, they conducted an orderly withdrawal, fighting rearguard actions to cover the retreat of other traitor forces. Mortarion, returned from his brief banishment, led his legion away from Terra with grim discipline. They were the last traitor legion to abandon the siege, extracting themselves from the killing fields methodically, while loyalist forces harried their flanks. The retreat into the Eye of Terror should have marked the end of the Death Guard as a cohesive force. Other traitor legions splintered into countless warbands, their unity shattered by defeat and internal conflicts over leadership and resources. But Mortarion held his sons together through the strength of their shared transformation. They were bound not just by loyalty to a Primarch, but by their common devotion to Nurgle. The Plague God had saved them, transformed them, given them purpose beyond mere survival. That shared experience created bonds stronger than simple military hierarchy. Within the Eye of Terror, Mortarion claimed a demon world as his new domain. He shaped it deliberately, moulding its reality until it mirrored aspects of Barbarous while incorporating elements of Nurgle's garden. The world became known simply as the Plague Planet, its surface a toxic morass of virulent swamps and disease-ridden jungles. Keeps of weeping stone rose from the poisoned landscapes, echoing the fortresses of the barbarous overlords. Human populations lived in the lowlands, forced to breathe toxic air and serve the Death Guard just as Mortarion's people had once served Necare. The irony was not lost on Mortarion himself. He had become what he most despised, a tyrant ruling from a poisoned mountain peak, using the weak as resources for his wars. But the Deathlord no longer cared about such contradictions. He had accepted his nature, embraced the hypocrisy as simply another form of decay. Everything eventually became its opposite. Strength turned to weakness, virtue to vice, life to death. This was the truth Nurgle had taught him, the fundamental law underlying all existence. Entropy consumed everything, and fighting against it was futile. Better to accept the inevitable and find purpose in spreading that acceptance to others. From the Plague Planet, Mortarion reorganized his legion. He maintained their traditional structure of 7 great companies, though each now bore the title of Plague Company, and was led by a Lord of Contagion blessed by Nurgle. The sacred number 7 permeated every aspect of Death Guard organization, from squad sizes to the number of Vectoriums deployed in major campaigns. This numerology was not mere superstition, but reflected genuine belief that conforming to Nurgle's sacred mathematics would draw the Plague God's favour and enhance their effectiveness in battle. The Death Guard developed specialised roles unknown in their pre-corruption existence. Plague surgeons took charge of gene seed repositories and the creation of new plague marines, using techniques that blended apothecary traditions with demonic biology. Biologus putrefiers became alchemists of disease, creating new plagues and refining existing ones for maximum lethality. Taliman kept meticulous records of every kill, every infection, every world brought to ruin, believing that Nurgle delighted in such detailed accounting. Noxious Blightbringers carried plague bells, whose tolling spread despair and supernatural sickness across battlefields. Despite Mortarion's hatred of Psykers, the Death Guard came to include sorcerers among their ranks. These malignant plague casters served as conduits for Nurgle's power, channeling the energies of the garden directly onto the battlefield. They could call forth plague winds that stripped flesh from bone, summon swarms of demon flies to descend upon enemies, or simply billow forth noxious vapours from their bloated bodies to choke and poison entire regiments. Mortarion tolerated them because Nurgle demanded it. His hatred of sorcery subordinated to his devotion to the Plague God, though he never truly made peace with their presence. The legion's numbers actually increased over the millennia following the heresy, while other traitor legions dwindled through attrition and factional conflict. The Death Guard found new recruits among those desperate enough or insane enough to embrace Nurgle's gifts. Some were captured Space Marines from Loyalist chapters, subjected to horrific transformation processes that stripped away their former identities and remade them as Plague Marines. Others were ambitious mortals who survived exposure to the most virulent plagues, their resistance interpreted as signs of Nurgle's favour. A few even came willingly, seeking the immortality and power that service to the Lord of Decay could provide. The process of creating new Plague Marines was horrific beyond measure. Aspirants were exposed to the Destroyer Plague in controlled doses, their transformations monitored by plague surgeons who intervened only to prevent actual death. Those who survived the initial infection were implanted with corrupted gene seed harvested from fallen Death Guard, the genetic material itself riddled with diseases that would have destroyed normal Astartes biology. The resulting warriors bore little resemblance to the noble Space Marines the Emperor had created, but they possessed all the combat effectiveness of their uncorrupted counterparts, plus supernatural resilience gifted by Nurgle. For 10,000 years, the Death Guard have prosecuted their long war against the Imperium. They emerge from the Eye of Terror aboard plague fleets, vast armadas of corrupted vessels trailing pestilent wakes through the warp. They fall upon Imperial worlds like a plague of locusts, spreading diseases that kill billions and transform the survivors into plague zombies and worse. They do not conquer in the traditional sense, do not hold territory or establish lasting governance. Instead, they corrupt, transforming pristine worlds into diseased hellscapes before withdrawing to let the Imperium deal with the aftermath. The Death Guard's campaigns follow patterns dictated by Nurgle's whims and the sacred numerology they worship. They strike 7 worlds, then withdraw. They besiege a fortress for 70 days before the final assault. They organize their forces into multiples of 7, believing this draws the Plague God's blessing. To outside observers, their actions often seem random or counterproductive, victories abandoned and strategic opportunities ignored in favor of maintaining these ritual patterns. But the Death Guard care nothing for conventional victory. Their goal is not conquest, but corruption. Not territorial gain, but the spread of Nurgle's gifts across the galaxy. When Abaddon the Despoiler launches his Black Crusades, the Death Guard often participate, lending their forces to the War Master's grand designs while maintaining their own agendas. Typhus in particular has become a force unto himself, leading his own Vectorium across the galaxy and spreading the Destroyer Plague to countless worlds. His relationship with Mortarion remains tense but functional, the Herald of Nurgle fighting under his Primarch's command when the cause is sufficiently important, while otherwise maintaining independence. Mortarion tolerates this insubordination, perhaps remembering his own rebellious relationship with the Emperor and choosing not to repeat those same mistakes. In recent centuries, the Death Guard have intensified their operations following the formation of the Great Rift. The galaxy-spanning warp storm has made travel easier for Chaos forces, while simultaneously devastating Imperial defenses and communication networks. The Death Guard exploited this chaos to launch the Plague Wars, a massive invasion of Ultramar led by Mortarion himself. For the first time in 10 millennia, the Deathlord returned to Imperial space in force, his armies spreading across the realm of the Ultramarines with the stated goal of corrupting every world Guilliman held dear. The Plague Wars saw the Death Guard deploy their full arsenal. Plague fleets systematically destroyed Ultramar's defense forces, while ground armies transformed entire worlds into breeding grounds for disease. The conflict raged for over a century of constant warfare, with neither side able to gain decisive advantage. Mortarion duelled Guilliman multiple times, the two Primarchs clashing amid the ruins of civilizations they had once fought together to build. Eventually the Death Guard were fought to a standstill on the plague-ridden world of Ajax, and Mortarion withdrew, but he considered the campaign a success. Ultramar would never fully recover, and the seeds of corruption planted during the Plague Wars would continue sprouting for generations. Today, the Death Guard remain one of the most cohesive and dangerous of the traitor legions. While the Emperor's children have descended into hedonistic madness, and the World Eaters have become little more than rabid berserkers, Mortarion's sons maintain discipline and tactical sophistication. They plan campaigns, coordinate multi-vector assaults, employ combined arms tactics. They are not mindless plague spreaders, but calculated strategists who happen to use disease as their primary weapon. This makes them far more dangerous than mere vectors of contagion, for they possess both the resilience to endure any countermeasure and the intelligence to exploit weaknesses in enemy defences. The transformation of the Death Guard from loyal Space Marines into Plague Marines serves as one of the Horus Heresy's most tragic cautionary tales. They did not fall through ambition like the sons of Horus or excess like the Emperor's children. They fell through desperation, through suffering too great to endure, through a moment of weakness when death seemed preferable to continued torment. In accepting Nurgle's salvation they found relief, but at the cost of everything they had been. Their legendary endurance, once humanity's shield, became a weapon turned against the Imperium they had sworn to protect. Yet from the Death Guard's own perspective, their fall was not damnation, but liberation. They are no longer afraid, for they have become death itself. They no longer suffer, for Nurgle has transformed their pain into purpose. They are eternal, deathless, immortal in their decay. The galaxy may view them as monsters and abominations, but they see themselves as blessed, as chosen, as the recipients of gifts beyond price. In Nurgle's embrace they have found acceptance of life's fundamental truth, that all things decay, all things corrupt, all things eventually return to the fertile soil from which new growth springs. The philosophical framework the Death Guard have adopted represents a complete inversion of their original beliefs. They once stood for endurance in service of preservation, holding ground so that human civilization could flourish behind their shield. Now they endure in service of decay, spreading corruption so that all things might achieve the state of rot they see as the natural end of existence. They believed weakness was contemptible, and the strong had a duty to protect the weak. Now they believe weakness is inevitable, and the strong have a duty to help the weak accept their dissolution with grace. Every principle they held has been twisted, every virtue they practice transformed into its dark reflection. This corruption extends beyond mere philosophy into the Death Guard's daily existence. They do not simply fight and kill. They cultivate. Each plague marine tends to their diseases the way a gardener tends plants, nurturing favourite strains and crossbreeding contagions to create new variants. They take professional pride in the quality of their plagues, competing among themselves to see whose creations can spread fastest or kill most creatively. A biologus putrefier who develops a particularly virulent strain receives accolades from his brothers and favour from Nurgle himself, recognition that drives them to ever greater heights of pestilent creativity. The Death Guard's relationship with Nurgle differs fundamentally from how other Chaos Legions relate to their patron gods. The World Eaters serve Khorne through mindless rage, the Emperor's children worship Slaanesh through hedonistic excess, the Thousand Sons followed Tzeentch through arcane scheming. But the Death Guard serve Nurgle through acceptance, through a paradoxical combination of passivity and zealous action. They accept that all things decay, yet work tirelessly to spread that decay. They embrace entropy, yet maintain rigid discipline and organisation. They are simultaneously passive fatalists and active agents of corruption. This duality manifests in their combat doctrine. The Death Guard do not seek glorious victories or decisive triumphs. They grind enemies down through attrition, advancing slowly but inexorably until opposition collapses from exhaustion and disease. Their battles often last far longer than necessary from a purely military standpoint, the Death Guard seemingly content to let time and plague do most of the work. Their targets reflect this patient approach. The Death Guard rarely attack military installations directly, preferring to strike at civilian populations and infrastructure. They contaminate water supplies, seed clouds with spores, infect a livestock with zoonotic diseases. By the time they arrive in force, the defenders are already dying, already demoralized, already infected with despair. The Imperium has developed specialized units to counter Death Guard operations, yet for all these countermeasures, the Death Guard remain one of the most successful traitor legions at achieving their strategic objectives, measured not in territory held but in suffering inflicted. Individual Death Guard warriors have become legendary in their own right. Typhus the Traveller roams the galaxy spreading the Destroyer Plague, his arrival on a world inevitably preceding outbreaks that kill billions. His plague fleet emerges from the warp-trailing clouds of flies and disease, bringing death to system after system in a wandering path dictated by Nurgle's whims. Behind him he leaves plague worlds, entire planets transformed into breeding grounds for disease, where the dead shamble as plague zombies and reality itself has sickened. The Death Guard's gene seed remains functional despite its corruption, though fundamentally altered by millennia of exposure to Nurgle's energies. The implantation process has become a horrific ritual, aspirants enduring agonies that kill most before they complete their transformation. Those who survive emerge already corrupted, their bodies host to diseases that would kill normal humans instantly. The Plague Planet itself serves as both fortress and laboratory for the Death Guard. Mortarion has shaped it into a realm where the boundaries between material and immaterial, living and dead, have all dissolved. Within this nightmare realm, the Black Manse rises as the largest of 7 great fortresses. Deep within its dungeons lie the Death Guard's gene seed repositories and Mortarion's personal libraries of forbidden knowledge. The Death Guard's victories are counted not in worlds conquered, but in civilizations corrupted. They measure success by the number who abandon faith in the Emperor and embrace Nurgle instead. Every plague cult they inspire, every world they transform, every battle where their resilience breaks enemy morale, these are their triumphs. This mission will never end, for entropy itself is eternal. The Death Guard will march until the stars grow cold, spreading their plagues across a universe that desperately resists. They are patient, for they have eternity to accomplish their goals. The long war continues, generation after generation, and the Death Guard endure as they have always endured, unbreakable in their corruption as they once were unbreakable in their purity. The wheel turns, entropy claims all, and the Death Guard march eternal, living embodiments of the ultimate truth they believe Nurgle has revealed. Death comes for everything, but they have become death, and in that becoming found a twisted form of immortality that mocks the very concept they once feared. As the plague consumed his legion, Mortarion himself began to sicken. Even a Primarch's body could only resist for so long against a disease crafted specifically to break the unbreakable. He felt the corruption spreading through his superhuman flesh, his legendary endurance prolonging his suffering just as it did for his sons. The realization that he would share their fate, that his strength meant only that he would endure more before succumbing, drove him to the edge of desperation. In his delirium, fevered and dying, Mortarion called out for deliverance from any source that would answer. The Destroyer Plague worked its corruption with methodical cruelty. It did not simply kill, it transformed. The Death Guard discovered that even their most basic biological functions had been compromised. Respirators clogged with fluid that smelled of rot and copper. Power armor seals burst under the pressure of swelling flesh. Warriors tried to remove their helmets for relief, only to find their faces had fused with the interior mechanisms, ceramite and bone grown together in grotesque union. Some attempted to end their suffering through self-inflicted wounds, but their altered biology refused to grant even that escape. Cuts sealed themselves with tumorous growths. Lasfire cauterized instantly, the corrupted flesh regenerating faster than it could be destroyed. In the medical bays, apothecaries worked frantically to understand the contagion, to find some weakness they could exploit. But their instruments registered readings that made no sense. The plague existed simultaneously as biological pathogen, demonic possession, and warp phenomenon. It operated on multiple levels of reality at once, corrupting flesh, soul, and the very laws of nature that governed living tissue. Every cure attempted only accelerated the transformation. Antibiotics caused the plague organisms to multiply. Psychic cleansing drew more demon flies like moths to flame. Amputation of infected limbs resulted in the disease spreading to the surgeons, and the severed parts continuing to writhe with unnatural life. The ships themselves became infected. The Destroyer Plague polluted the physical substance of the vessels as easily as it did the warriors within. Corridors wept with condensation that reeked of decay. Walls developed lesions that oozed substances best left unexamined. The machine spirits that governed ship functions began to sicken, their cogitator cores developing the digital equivalent of fever and madness. Reactors burned with sickly green light instead of their usual blue-white radiance. The very metal of the hulls began to show signs of corruption, developing patches of rust and corrosion that spread like melanomas across steel skin. Within this nightmare, Callus Typhon moved with purpose. While his brothers writhed in agony, the first captain stood on the bridge of his flagship Terminus Est, watching the plague's progression with something approaching satisfaction. The paralysis that had struck the fleet had affected him first, dropping him to his knees as the destroyer hive's demon flies filled his lungs and throat. But where others screamed, Typhon welcomed the invasion. He had known this moment was coming, had prepared for it through his secret devotions to the ruinous powers. When he finally stirred, rising uncertainly to his feet, he spoke only one phlegm-laced word that echoed across the Vox channels: more. With that single utterance, the flies abandoned their other hosts in droves, swarming toward Typhon in a cloud so dense it obscured visibility. They poured into his mouth and nose, his eyes and ears, burrowing through the seals of his Terminator armor to access the flesh beneath. His body swelled grotesquely as thousands upon thousands of demon insects made their home in his transformed physiology. But Typhon did not fall. He remained standing, his armoured frame expanding to accommodate the hive growing within him. Great funnels of pestilential bone erupted from his back, chimneys through which the flies could enter and exit their new host. The transformation was both reward and curse. Blessing and damnation intertwined so thoroughly that they could not be separated. Typhon had become Typhus, herald of Nurgle and host of the Destroyer Hive. His skin and armour had fused into a single composite structure, ceramite plates bonding with diseased flesh to create something that was neither fully organic nor mechanical. The bone chimneys sprouting from his shoulders coughed black decay as Nurgle's servants regurgitated psychic energies through what remained of his mortal form. Inside the hollow shell of his body, demon flies gnawed and bred, creating generations of plague carriers that would spread the destroyer across the galaxy for 10,000 years to come. He was the most blessed and most cursed of all his kin, the living proof that Nurgle's gifts were double-edged beyond mortal comprehension. Throughout the fleet, other Death Guard began their own transformations. As the plague reached its crescendo in each warrior, they faced a choice, though calling it a choice implied more agency than most possessed in their delirium. They could resist, clinging to the remnants of their loyalty to the Emperor, and die in agony over the course of days or weeks. Or they could surrender, accepting Nurgle's embrace and gaining release from the pain in exchange for eternal service to the Plague God. Most chose survival over principle, their agonized minds grasping at any escape from suffering. A few held out longer, their faith or stubbornness keeping them human even as their bodies betrayed them. These warriors took weeks to transform fully, their extended resistance resulting in more extreme mutations when they finally broke. The plague did not discriminate based on rank or achievement. Captains who had led companies through countless battles found themselves reduced to mewling creatures begging for mercy. Veterans who had served since the Legion's founding discovered that millennia of experience meant nothing against supernatural disease. The Death Guard's rigid hierarchy dissolved as the strongest fell alongside the weakest, united in suffering regardless of their previous status. The Primarch tried everything within his power to save his Legion. He ordered the ships to break free of the warp, to force transition back to real space regardless of the danger. But the fleet was held fast in Nurgle's grip, becalmed in stagnant tides of the Empyrean. He commanded Typhon to redouble his navigational efforts, not yet understanding that his first captain had engineered this trap. He consulted with the few remaining apothecaries who could still function, seeking medical solutions to a problem that transcended biology. Nothing worked. The destroyer consumed them all with patient inevitability. In the depths of his fever-racked delirium, Mortarian's thoughts turned to forbidden possibilities. He had always hated psychers, despised the use of warp powers as the tools of tyrants and monsters. But he was not ignorant of such things. His years fighting Barbaros's overlords had taught him much about sorcery and the entities that dwelt beyond the veil of reality. He knew there were powers in the warp, beings of immense capability who might be able to save his Legion, if properly entreated. The Primarch's resolve crumbled by degrees. First he allowed himself to consider options he had previously rejected. Then he began to actively search his knowledge for potential solutions. Finally, in a moment of weakness amplified by delirium and suffering beyond even a Primarch's ability to withstand, Mortarion called out into the warp. Not a prayer exactly, for he prayed to no gods, but a plea, a desperate bargain offered to whatever powers might be listening. "Save my Legion," he offered into the swirling madness of the Empyrean. "Give them release from this torment." His call was heard. In the depths of the warp, Nurgle smiled. The Lord of Decay had been waiting for this moment since before the Death Guard fleet entered the Immaterium. Everything had proceeded according to plan. Now the Primarch himself was ready, broken by suffering, humbled by helplessness, willing to accept aid from any source. The Plague God stirred in his garden of rotten renewal, preparing to welcome new children into his loving embrace.